Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Ben Hohen. I'm a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I'm joined by Grace Britton to talk about a new report called Starting with Solar, a preliminary assessment of solar energy systems in residential new construction. Just a little bit of housekeeping here. You will note that as you joined the webinar, you were muted. That's intentional, but we want to hear from you. So do try to find the Q&A window of your user controls and submit questions via that window. Once we get done with the webinar, we'll take an effort to go through those questions and answer them. As you probably heard, this webinar is recorded. So if you have to drop off or others in your network want to hear about it, we will be posting the recording of this webinar after it today. So why don't we get started here? So as I mentioned, I'm joined by Grace Britton. She was a former graduate student researcher at Berkeley Lab, and since left us, gone on to greener pastures at Cypress Creek Renewables, working on project finance. But it's been a pleasure working with her on this report, and you'll get to hear her voice in a little bit. I'm going to do a quick bit of introduction and then turn it over to Grace. Also, I'd like to thank the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technologies Office that supported this work. Obviously, without their support, we couldn't have done this. So this is the agenda for today. I'm going to cover the introduction, give you a little bit of policy and background on the work, the motivation and the scope of the work, and talk a little bit about the data, the methodology, and the analysis that we conducted here. And then Grace is going to take it over and really get into those areas, talk about new solar home system and home characteristics, talk about the penetration of new solar homes in the solar homes in the new solar home market. And then we're going to go in and look at some of the characteristics that seem to be correlated with higher or lower levels of penetration, ultimately resulting in the results from a logistic regression to give folks a better understanding of where we see some patterns as to where higher levels of solar penetration is happening in the new home market, which might give folks a sense as to what maybe levers might drive higher levels of penetration if they so desire. So the introduction, the motivation of this work is that we have just an enormous new home market in the United States. Roughly over 1 million homes are start construction each year on average. Of course, COVID made that a little difficult to keep up that average, but over the last 11 years, there's been a total of 140 million single-family homes built. Although a relatively small percentage of these homes have solar on them, it does provide an attractive avenue to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The codes that are for new homes are often getting tweaked to do just that, to decrease the energy dependence of these homes. And it allows policymakers one lever that they can use to influence that, where they can't maybe otherwise influence as readily the existing home market. So as efforts scale to reduce energy use and emissions, we thought it would be useful to provide a baseline understanding of this current market of solar homes, and try to look at where there might be examples of higher or lower levels of penetration. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the California solar mandate and how the timing of that intersects with this work and why it gave us a separate motivation. So this California solar mandate that I mentioned was enacted in 2018 and went into effect January 1st of 2020. And what it requires is that all new homes in California have solar systems installed. There are requirements for the size of that solar system. It need not meet the entire building's load, but it needs to have a solar system on it. And so it was interesting to us to look at the period prior to the solar mandate. Prior to that, there in California, there was what was called the California New Solar Home Partnership Incentive Program that started in 2007 and ran through 2018. And in fact, some systems installed after that that were permitted or put through the application for the incentive could have been built and receive that incentive even though the program ran out. That incentive was only offered through the 3 investor-owned utility service areas. So Pacific Gas and Electric, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Southern California Edison. You'll hear us talk about this IOU service areas on a number of slides as we moved into the presentation. So I wanted to call that out. If you were outside of that IOU area, you weren't going to be able to receive the California New Solar Home Partnership Incentive. This was a carve out specifically for the new home market. It was over and above other incentives that were offered, specifically the federal incentives. And outside of the New Solar Home Partnership, we are not aware of other policies that existed to incentivize new solar home adoption. And so when we look, our analysis looks outside of California, we take into account the fact that really none of those programs existed, and therefore California is unique in some sense. So that gives you a sense as to why we looked at these data. And in terms of the actual data, we're combining data from LBNL's Tracking the Sun data set. Some of you might be familiar with that. It's an annual data collection effort to look at the installed cost of solar across the country. It's an enormous data set. And we match that data set with CoreLogic's data of single family and duplex homes. We have from them characteristics of those homes and transaction information. So we're able to identify if a home is new and it's sold at that point and the characteristics of that home. Then we use multiple other data sets to fill in characteristics, which you'll hear about today, some of which you'll hear about today, but are in the full report if you do not hear about them today, such as the utility service area and the area median income and things like that. We limited the coverage of our analysis to any zip code that had at least one solar home in it. It need not be a new home with solar. It just needs to be a home with solar. And that limited us to around 12,369 zip codes out of roughly 41,000 across the US. But that still gave us a lot of coverage. We've got 18 states that these data cover. Some states are not fully covered, and some states are well covered. For example, in Florida, it's limited only to 21 zip codes. We just don't have great data from California coming in for the Tracking the Sun data set. There are 961 zip codes in Florida. So we don't do a great job in that state, but we do a good job in other states. In our analysis, we really compare California to every other state. Ideally, in the future, where we have more coverage and more time to look at this, we might dig into individual states. But in this analysis, we're really just breaking those two up into California and not California. And you'll see why that break is useful. In terms of the sample period, we collected data through 2021, but after kind of realizing how long it takes to get these systems permitted and ultimately operated in the house sold, we had to limit the transactions to roughly June of 2020. But we do go back quite early in time, around 2000 as we start our analysis. In terms of methodology, we have kind of 3 things we'll be talking about today: solar system and home characteristics. This is just looking at averages across a variety of characteristics for that solar system in the home. Then we focus on new solar home penetration. This is sort of the calculation we're trying to do to better understand how many homes that sold had solar on them and what are some of the variables that seem to be correlated with higher or lower levels of penetration. And finally, to take the various analysis we do that might be binomial or multinomial, looking at penetration correlations, we run a logistic regression that allows us to compare a number of characteristics simultaneously to see which ones are the strongest correlates with higher or lower levels of penetration. In terms of the data set, the map gives you a sense of that coverage. As you can see, we do really well in some states, not so well in other. And there are the few zip codes in Florida that I mentioned. In total, we're looking at a data set In California, around just under 500,000 homes. Many of those are existing homes that we use as our comparable data set, but we have 18,000 new solar homes. Outside of California, we have roughly 220,000 existing solar homes and only 800 new solar homes. So these are the data that we'll be looking at. We're primarily focused on the solar homes in this data set. So that's roughly 19,000 and change. And we'll be talking about them in greater detail. And that gets me to the end of the introduction. And so I'm going to stop sharing and let Grace take it over from her desktop, and take it away, Grace.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. So now I'm going to be talking about the characteristics of new and existing solar homes, both inside and outside of California. And in this case, existing solar homes are homes that had solar installed after they were built. And in contrast, new solar homes are the ones that had it installed at the time or around the time that it was built. So first, I'm just going to walk you through the format of this slide because we'll have a few slides using the same format. So on the left, we show an attribute over time, in this case, solar PV system size. And the x-axis shows the installation year. And then on top, we'll look at California over time, both for new and existing homes. And then on bottom, we'll look at other states outside of California for new and existing homes. And then the chart on the right shows all four of those groups, new, existing, inside and outside of California, but only for more recent years, 2018 to 2020. So it'll show the mean, and then the error bar shows the 90% confidence interval. So in this case, we're looking at system size, and you'll see that system size has been gradually increasing over time, but for new homes, it's been largely constant in California over time. And this may be due to new homes being more energy efficient, so they don't need as large of system size potentially as existing homes. And then next we looked at home size in general in terms of square feet. And you'll see that this also has been relatively constant over time. In recent years, new homes have had larger system sizes, have been larger homes, but in contrast to the previous slide on the system size, this is like further shows that new homes may be more energy efficient because they're larger, but don't need as large of system sizes. And then we also looked at battery installation, and you can see in recent years, it's been quite striking. Prior to that, there was very little battery installation for either new or existing homes. But then in California for existing homes, it's really been increasing over time. And then looking at California versus other states, in recent years, California has had about 3x the amount of battery installation than solar systems in other states. We also looked at third-party ownership, and you can see that while it's kind of gone up and then stayed stagnant over time, it tends to be more common in new homes, particularly outside of California. And it is a bit interesting because for new homes, builders are the ones that decide whether it's going to be third-party owned or a different financing system, whereas for existing homes, homeowners are the ones making that choice. And then in recent years, there's been more financing options available, so potentially existing homeowners are choosing other options rather than third-party ownership. And now I'm going to walk through new home penetration levels. And Ben mentioned this earlier, but penetration is like the percent. If you look at all new homes, what percent of those have solar? And we'll be breaking that down throughout the next few slides. So first, we just wanted to look at California versus other states over time. And first, you'll see in the left graph that other states, you can't even really see it on the axis because they have such low levels of new solar homes. So we had to break it out, enlarge it on the other side. So California has, around 2020, has gone up to around 40% solar penetration for new homes, whereas other states don't even hit 1% yet. And California, it's interesting, around 2018, they had already hit around 35% penetration for new homes, even prior to the mandate. So the New Solar Home Partnership had done a lot to incentivize new homes, even prior to this mandate. And then I just want to look within California, within that large 40% penetration level. If you break it down by geography, there's actually quite a bit of variation. Some counties have greater than 70% penetration, and other counties have very low, around 10% or closer to 0% penetration. And then I'm bouncing back nationally. I will be bouncing back a few times between California and other states, so I'll try to keep you informed, but just hang with us as we bounce back and forth geographically. So now looking back to nationally, although outside California, the penetration is very low, less than 1%. Some states are doing actually quite well in terms of new solar home penetration. So Arizona, around 4%, Nevada, around 3%, Utah is also above 1%. So as you can see, there's definitely a lot of variation depending on geography. And now we wanted to look at trying to figure out what's driving those differences in penetrations and breaking down the penetration by different factors or subcategories to start to understand this. And here's just an example of the slides that'll follow in the format. So I just want to walk you through the format of this slide as an example so that you can understand it for the characteristics moving forward. So on the left, we have penetrations within categories. So if we have sample B and sample A, and we want to compare them, we'll look at the penetration for sample B and the penetration for sample A. And then the middle graph, we're looking at the overall penetration for the combination of A and B, but then we'll break it down by the sample. So if California had 40% penetration, but IOU was one subcategory and non-IOU was other, like how does that add up to the 40%? And then the final chart is another version of the middle chart. It just organizes it to 100%. So we're looking at all new solar homes and then what percent of each were in each category over time. So first we looked at investor-owned utilities, which Ben mentioned earlier is important because the new solar home partnership policy did not apply outside of these investor-owned utilities, but it did apply within investor-owned utilities. So you can see on the chart on the left that investor-owned utilities had much higher penetrations than non-IOUs, around 50% versus close to 0%. And if you look at the other two graphs, just very little new solar homes were happening outside of the IOUs. I will caveat this by saying that our non-IOU data is somewhat limited, so there is some error in our estimates for the non-IOU data, but the numbers are still very low where the policy is not available. And then we also looked at builder size. Our hypothesis was that larger builders might be able to build large subdivisions and have economies of scale to put more solar on, or they might have bigger accounting divisions that can help take advantage of the new solar home partnership. So we broke it down by large builders, which were the top 10 in California by market share in 2019 versus smaller builders. And so on the chart on the left, you can see that larger builders did have higher penetrations, around 60% versus around 30% for the smaller builders. But in the other two charts, you can see that while the penetrations were higher for larger builders, like the smaller builders made up of more volume in California. So there's still a similar percentage when you look at all homes. However, there's large variation around these large builders. So on this graph, we looked at the top builders by market share in California, which is on the right axis and denoted by the X. And then on the left axis, we're looking at their solar penetration. So the blue bar is all regions and the green bar is looking only within investor-owned utilities where the policy was available. So you can see, for example, Lennar, the highest market share in California in 2019 were within investor-owned utilities was building around 90% of their homes with solar, around 95% of their homes with solar. But then there's a bit of variation with the other builders. Toll and Shea were more around 40%, but then Woodside also had very high numbers. One thing to note about Lennar that makes it special is that they are vertically integrated. They have they were affiliated with a solar company and previously owned it. And so they were installing it themselves. So they're sort of a special case within this graph. And next I'm going to show you outside of California. So first, just Remember, you know, the names Lennar, Toll, Shea, KB, and DR Horton, all in this graph, you know, all above 30–40% penetration. And then when we look outside of California, looking at these same large builders, the numbers are quite different. So here, again, we're ranking it from left to right by market share outside of California. DR Horton is the largest in this case, and Lennar is second. But the solar penetrations are very low across the board. So Lennar was doing, you know, 95% in California, whereas outside other states was around 1%. Similar with Toll, Shea, KB, etc. So this is sort of indicating that California is special, and potentially this could be because of the new solar home partnership. And Ben will examine this relationship further in a regression later in the presentation. And then continuing outside of California, we wanted to look at which builders were doing a lot of new solar homes outside of California. So we ordered them from left to right by their solar penetration. And then we're also showing their market share, which is quite low. So Larrabee, for example, was doing around 35% of their new homes with solar, but their market share is only, you know, 0.05%. So we think these are sort of smaller regional builders, but they've kind of specialized in new solar homes. So there are some builders doing this, it's just not as common outside of California. And then flipping back to California, we wanted to kind of investigate some features that could be driving the large builder, small builder difference. So we wanted to look at population densities, because potentially these large builders can build large areas in less populous areas. And so you can see on the left chart, there doesn't appear to be a huge difference in solar penetration in California based on builder size, but Ben will examine this relationship further in the regression later on. And similarly, we wanted to look at income brackets in areas. So we looked at area median income, and, you know, of course, solar might be more common in areas where people have more disposable income and you can afford to pay more for a solar system on a new home. And that doesn't appear to be a clear relationship here, although the lower income group in light gray does have lower solar penetrations. The highest median group did not have the highest solar penetration, so it doesn't appear to be a direct relationship. But again, Ben will analyze this further later in the presentation. And then finally, we wanted to look at electricity rates, because people might be driven to get solar or want solar on a new home because if electricity rates are really high, solar could help them lower their bill or drop them to a lower tier. So we looked at solar penetration by state, and then we broke out California by the 3 investor-owned utilities: Southern California Edison, PG&E, SDG&E. And then we looked the green dot, the average retail rate. And of course, this is just a rough average. It doesn't mask, I mean, it masks like individual home rates, tiered rates, time of use rates. So this is just a cursory average, but it gives us a sense to look at penetration versus retail rate. And what we see is that we're not seeing a clear relationship between penetration and retail rate. Within California, it's an opposite relationship. SDG&E has the highest rates with the lowest penetration compared to Southern California Edison. So we did not find this to be a clear explanation. And now I'll pass it back to Ben to talk through the regression.
Great, thanks, Grace. And I appreciate we've gotten some questions in already. We're going to answer them at the end of the presentation. But please put your thinking hats on and type in the questions you're looking to get answers to, and we'll see if we can answer them. So if you'll advance to the next slide, Grace. So what's a logistic regression? You might be wondering that. Logistic regression is a multinomial regression that allows us to compare the correlations that a set of what are called independent variables or correlates have with a dependent variable. We can also talk about right side and left side of the equation. The left side is the dependent variable. And in this case, the left side variable, our dependent variable, is the probability the new home has a solar system on it at the time of sale. It either has it or it doesn't. And so it's not a regression that allows you to have a normal distribution. It's just a binomial distribution. In this case, that's why logistic regressions are very useful. Ultimately, the results of this kind of regression come out in what are called odds or probabilities. The probability that a home has a solar system at the time of sale or does not have a solar system at the time of sale. And so some of the figures you'll see on the next few slides are a little confusing. I mean, it would be great if it was just like a number that you could completely understand, but it's tough to sort of make sense of odds, ratios, and those sorts of things. But obviously higher odds or higher numbers of odds, you increase your confidence that there's a strong relationship there, where lower numbers would tend to say that there isn't much of a relationship there. We looked at a variety of covariates as shown kind of listed here in text. I'm going to just go over them as we get to the next slide rather than dealing with them here. But this is for those of you that are statisticians in the group and want to know how we put together the model. If you'll go to the next slide, Grace, I can do just that. So these are the three models we ran here, model 1, 2, and 3. The first model focused on just homes that were in California, just new homes in California. The second model focused on just new homes outside of California. And the third model combined both those California and non-California data sets. The numbers of homes we looked at are shown almost at the bottom of the table. There's an N at the left. So roughly 30,000 homes that we looked at. Those are new homes in California. Roughly 100,000 homes outside of California, and in total, roughly 130,000 homes combined. There is a shown below the N of McFadden's R squared. This is sort of a what's called a pseudo R squared. It gives you some sense as to how well the model is doing at predicting all of the times when homes have solar and when they don't. Obviously, the one on the right, model 3, does the best job of predicting or understanding the correlates of the presence of solar or not. But all of the models tell us something about the individual variables, the independent variables. Those are marked with either black text and not bolded, or green text or green fonts and bolded. The ones that are bolded with green font are highly statistically significant, have a probability of less than 1% that would have been there by chance. But as I mentioned, as I was discussing this logistic regression, it's actually the size of those odds ratios that we're curious about. Things that are close to 1, 0 and 1 are relatively small. Basically an effect at 1 is no effect at all. And then you can be negative, impending that as the individual variable increases in value, the probability of having solar decreases. That's why you'd have a negative number for some of those. And when they're positive, it's the exact opposite, where that increases or is present, it increases the likelihood or that a home has solar, or it's correlated with the higher presence of solar. So now I'll step through the individual models and what we see here. So in the case of the first row, we're looking at whether the home was located, in the case of model 1, in the IOU territories where the New Solar Home Partnership incentive existed. And we can see, not surprisingly, based on all the slides that Grace has gone over prior to this, that seems to be a very strong predictor of the presence of solar, that you're in one of the California IOU territories. The second strongest predictor, at least in the California model, is that you're one of the top 10 builders in terms of market share. If you were one of those, you are much more likely to have solar on your new homes than if you were not one of the top 10 builders. And then we can kind of step through the remainder. The average electricity rate is not statistically significant. Zip code median income is statistically significant, but very, very small in terms of the odds ratios, so effectively de minimis. Home assessed value at the time of sale, similarly, very, very small effect. And finally, population density is a little larger in terms of its magnitude, its absolute value, and it's negative. This seems to say that in areas where there is higher population density, it's less likely that a home would have solar, a new home would have solar on it than the opposite. One of the theories behind that, and we don't know for sure, is that these are where homes tend to be built in greater volumes, in areas with lower population density, in more rural areas. That's where larger subdivisions exist. That's where a number of the top 10 builders tend to build their homes. And in that case, maybe that's why we see solar there, where the opposite, in urban areas where there isn't much land area to buy up and have be a build out of new homes, we see less frequency of solar there. Moving on to the non-California market for Model 2, we see something interesting as it relates to the top 10 builders. There's actually kind of a reverse correlation here. Those top 10 builders in the United States, many of which were the same top 10 builders in California, have a lower probability of installing solar outside of California than the other builders that are building new homes outside of the California market. So pretty interesting difference there. And we'll actually talk a little bit about why that exists in a moment. Same sort of results for average electricity rate, zip code median income, and a home assessed value. And in the case of population density, we don't see a statistically significant relationship there for the non-California market. Finally, when we combine all the data together in all of US for Model 3, we find very similar results, except for the top 10 builder in the US. In this case, the California market is effectively dominating the rest of the data set. We talked about the frequency of new homes in California versus the frequency of new homes outside of California. And so those home builders that were top 10 in California, many of which were also top 10 outside of California or in the United States in general, had a higher frequency of new solar homes or solar homes that were part of their new home collection. And because California is dominating that data set, that's why we get a statistically significant and positive coefficient for that one. So that kind of rounds out that slide. Why don't we move on to the conclusions, Grace? So this just summarizes everything that you've just heard. We've assembled a unique data set of new homes and existing homes through 2020. New homes that were built and sold through 2020 and existing homes that existed prior to that. We've got 13 million existing homes in our data set and 527 new homes. Of course, many of them are not solar. We've got roughly 700,000 solar homes, of which roughly 20,000 were new solar homes. And we've looked at those in these 18 states plus California and the District of Columbia. We find that California is really different. Something happened in California that was not happening outside of California, even though many of you on the call know that there were pretty generous incentives for solar outside of California. Some states have 100,000 solar homes, for example, Massachusetts being an example of that. California generally leads the market in terms of solar penetration, whether it's new or not new. But what was unique is the new solar home partnership that seemed to really incentivize that particular marketplace. Accordingly, some of the drivers for new solar home penetration that we see are the new solar home partnership incentive, the presence for that, and if the builder was one of the largest in terms of market share. The average retail electricity rate, home value, median income, and population density do not show strong correlations, and to some degree mixed, depending on whether you're inside or outside of California. And interestingly, outside of California, larger builders are not associated with greater new home construction, giving us a sense that again, that incentive was unique. They were able to take advantage of it in California and felt like, what's the worth of doing solar outside of California if that incentive doesn't exist? In terms of the characteristics of the solar homes and the homes, the systems, new solar homes tend to be smaller in size in terms of their system size, but they're associated with larger homes. They have lower battery attachment rates, and those new solar homes tend to be more likely to be third-party owned. So that is the, oh, excuse me, one more slide. So we wanted to know whether we were just sort of finding correlations that were floating in from the breeze, or whether we were actually getting at something that seems to be well understood in the marketplace. So we had a number of conversations with Building Industry Association representatives and as well builders, and found that we were not, in fact, very far off with what we seem to be finding in our analysis, that new solar home incentives played a big part for driving these builders to decide to put solar. As Grace mentioned, Lennar even had a division that installed solar on all of their homes. After a period of time, they did sell that division, but for a good amount of time, they were taking advantage of that profit opportunity. And why does solar not make sense outside of the market? They just didn't feel, this is based on large builder number 2, which is going to be unidentified, that it didn't really pencil out. And I think in part because of the incentives there. So one of the conclusions we can take away from this is that if practitioners are interested in incentivizing new solar homes or homes that are new to have solar on them, there probably needs to be a more aggressive set of state or local policies to incentivize that. As well, builders need to come along slowly to figure out how they can monetize that incentive. So I'll leave it there, and then we'll turn to questions here. And Grace, you and I can just kind of ping pong back and forth. Looks like we have 6 questions that have come in. I just want to answer one that I already answered to the questioner, which is, how are we going to get a copy of this presentation? It will be available to all the registrants. And so we'll send you notice that this is available. It will just be a link you can click on it. I think it's posted on YouTube. We'll also post it on the website landing page for this report. And so folks can just search for it later. But if you're registered and you're here for sure, you will get a link for that in a day or 2 once I get a copy of it.
Cool. I can answer the first question. The first question was, how did you get this data on home builders? And it's available in our CoreLogic data set that we use that has information on all home transactions in the US. And if it's a new home, there's a seller field within it. And so if it's a new home, it'll list the builder that sold it. So easy question there.
Hey, Grace, can I ask you a question about that? Did you also look at other sources of sort of ranking what are the top builders outside of the US and things like that?
Yeah, we also looked for the rankings. We looked at, I'm forgetting the name. We looked at different rankings, building association websites to get the list of the top builder associations, and they were based on 2019 market shares.
And we have those links in the final report that's on the website.
Great. Okay. Next question. Have you or others studied the emerging benefits of the solar partnership in California, i.e. how much have residents saved on their utility bill since implementation? Does that change for IOU versus non-IOU?
Yeah, so I can take a stab at that one.
Okay.
The California CEC is what runs the California incentive programs. All of the programs now have sunsetted. There are no incentives for California solar anymore. And as part of that incentive program, they were required to look at kind of the net benefit of these incentives. And so some of those reports that are on the CEC website that are done, I think annually or biannually, have some of those data, sort of how are people making out with having solar or not. Surely there have been other analyses that have looked at whether it's good to go solar or not. It has a lot to do with the underlying retail electricity rate. In the case of California, it's a tiered rate so that many people opt to have solar if they can drop out of one tier into another. That tier is determined by their consumption of energy, and they might drop from, let's say, I'm going to make these numbers up, but give a feel for it, let's say 45 cents per kilowatt hour down to 32 cents per kilowatt hour. If they were to decrease their consumption, and if they have solar on the house, they are going to decrease their consumption. So those are some examples of how people can be better off when they have solar, but it really depends on an individual homeowner and the incentive structure that they're availed during that time. And of course, the cost of that system at the time of installation, that differs tremendously across the country and over time. So,
and
next
question.
Go ahead.
Oh, you can read. Okay. Is California keeping net metering under the solar mandate? And I mean, net metering is still, I believe, being decided, NEM 3, but I believe it's not affiliated or dependent on the solar mandate. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, my understanding, and I wish I knew more about NEM 3. There
Yeah.
might be folks on the call that know a lot about NEM 3, but there's been a lot of discussion as to cost sharing and these sorts of things, because obviously those that have solar and can potentially discount their amount that they spend on electricity each month are not contributing as much to the upkeep of the transmission and distribution grid in California. And there's been a lot of discussion as to how to balance those costs out while still encouraging greater adoption of solar in the state. So that's for the policymakers and the state PUCs to think about. You can look up NEM 3 to get a better feel for those policies and where they're being discussed now.
Okay, the next question's on the model, if you want to take that one, Ben.
Yeah, so why did I include Model 3 if it's useless? Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the point of it was just to kind of curious to see whether we got that same result for the greater than, if you want to flip back 2 slides here, Grace, to that model.
Yeah.
We were kind of curious whether the home builders that were the largest ones outside of the United States were still going to be negative when taking into account the California market, and it just dominated it. Yeah, so maybe it's sort of a counterfactual here that California is dominating it, but it is interesting to see them together. We've done a better job of predicting for the presence of solar, but obviously California is sort of dominating things there as well, because we have very few homes. This is a model that maybe you could come back to 5 years from now, or hopefully we have more penetration of solar in outside of California and see whether it still stands. So it's a place in time kind of analysis. This is a preliminary analysis, and hopefully we can come back to some of these tools we've used in the past and see whether they still are present and give you the same results in the future. But really good question. I accept that criticism. So I'll read this one to you, Grace.
Yeah.
Equipment costs have come down substantially in the last 10 years, leading to larger residential retrofit sizes over time, as you showed, but the new build installs are quite smaller. And you commented that these new homes are probably more energy efficient, so would reach their net metering limit with a smaller array. Okay, that might be true. Can that be extrapolated to the retrofit market? Meaning, would new retrofits frequently be installing as much solar as their net metering limit?
One thing I didn't mention, which is sort of tangential to your question, is that they also partially have smaller systems, because when we had conversations with builders, they said that they were sort of building like the baseline limit. They wouldn't be installing like the largest system possible. They would typically be installing sort of a smaller system, just a standard baseline system, whereas people retrofitting their own homes might want to offset all of their electricity uses or do bigger ones, but larger builders are typically just putting on smaller systems in general.
Yeah, and Grace brings up a really good point, because you can think about it. A lot of these homes are being built without the buyer known. And so their actual home electricity usage is not documented. In the case of an existing home, we have history of usage, so we can match the system size to right there at usage, the consumption level. Where for new homes, you kind of just roll the dice as to what kind of buyer it might be. It might be, one bachelor with a cat, and that's it. And another home might be sold to a family of 6. It really depends. So yeah, again, we heard from builders that they are not pushing that because they really don't know what usage the home will have, and therefore try to keep the cost down as much as they can, yet still take advantage of the incentives. And now post mandate, they're doing the same thing. They're just sort of meeting the requirements of the mandate, but not oversizing these systems to try to match load, because they really don't know what load is for many cases. I don't know if we've answered your question, but I hope we gave you some useful information. Do large builders receive the incentive or the new owner? And how does that relate to the new home price? This is a great question. Do you want to take a stab at it, Grace?
Yeah, so the builders receive the incentive. In theory, this could also increase the home price because adding solar to the home is worth more to the buyer. And then builders in California kind of feel that this pencils out because the market will bear an increase in price because prices in California are already so high. So they kind of get the incentive and are able to sell it typically at a higher price. Is there anything you want to add, Ben?
Yeah, one more thing is that, we talk about large builders and small builders, and I think the assumption to many of you on the call might be that they are the ones installing solar, but in many cases they weren't. I mean, we talked about Lennar that had a company that actually, it was part of their vertically integrated company that installed solar, but they ultimately spun that off to another company that installed it for them. And for a lot of builders, that's exactly what they do. They hire a company that is specialized, just like any other trade, and say, okay, you're plumbers, do the plumbing, you're, solar installers, you do the solar system. And so the incentives could be borne by a third party. For example, the solar installer might have a third party partner that finances those systems, and that's how the contract is put together for the homeowner. It could be the case that the builder takes on that cost and enjoys the incentives. And it could be the case that the system, as you saw, isn't always a third-party owned system, and therefore that system is fully owned by the homeowner at the time of purchase. And that's very much along the lines of what Grace said. Those are scenarios where one would expect the house would be of higher value, but of course you get something for that. You get a new solar system that you can enjoy the use of, and you don't have any other payments for, such as a third-party system where you're going to have a lease payment.
Ben, I know you are familiar with the next question.
Yeah, are new solar homes able to include solar price in the mortgage? Absolutely, if it's owned by the homeowner. If it's owned by a third party, if it is not considered real estate, it's not an attachment to the real estate, meaning that system is not considered an attachment to the real estate or a fixture. Actually, that's the terminology. And if it's not a fixture, it can't be included in the sale price of the home, the appraised value of the home, and nor can be transferred via a regular deed. It would have to be outside of the transaction. In the case of systems that are owned by the homeowner, yeah, those are fully considered real estate and would be available to be rolled into the purchase price of the home. Next question is, did you or could you look at home sales price to see if that was correlated to solar installation, either in California IU territory or outside in other states?
I think we might have that. We ran that. Excuse me while I flip through our appendix.
We did not include it in the final report.
Yes.
So this is something we look at. This.
I may only have the assessed value. Let's see.
Oh, I see what you're looking at, whether there is a higher home price.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
I don't think we have that in the appendix, unfortunately. Or let me just quickly. Oh, home assessed value, home sale price. Okay, this is what I was looking for. So we looked at home sale price and sort of broke it into 4 buckets, below or above the median. And we did not see huge differences. In fact, the highest homes in dark blue, 125% above median, actually had the lowest solar penetration in general. but we did not break it down by IOU versus outside IOU.
Yeah. And
we did not look outside of California as well, or
yeah.
at least not in the appendix. Yeah.
Right. I thought I started to answer the question as if someone wanted to look whether we saw a premium in home prices, and that's work the lab has done before. We actually have done some new work with Fannie Mae on this question of what are the premiums for solar homes inside and outside of California and for different home types, new and existing homes, and how that's changed over time. Different report. It's actually in the process of being submitted to a journal, and hopefully we'll get it out on the street sometime in the future. So this is just my shameless plug for that work for the future. Next comment is I'd suggest you run the analysis using tier 3 electric rates in California, because average residential rates don't tell you anything. Entirely agree. We just struggled to get this for any individual home. We had all the rest of our data were generally at the home level. We don't know what their rates are. We don't know what their consumption is and where they are. But you bring up a good point. We could theoretically just use another rate in California that maybe is more common. So good point there. And it could be the case that that is a better predictor of the presence of solar on new homes than this average retail rate. So we accept that criticism. Okay, I'll read this one to you, Grace. You can take a stab. But California is constituted by Silicon Valley, top-ranking universities of the world. They are well-informed and eager to change into innovative systems. My question would be on determining the ownership structure and consumer behavior influence in the study. So I think what you're saying is, are these early adopters for solar that are in California, and is that maybe what's driving some of it in and above the over and above the incentive? And surely that's true. California has those individuals. I wouldn't say they're exclusive to California. Surely there are other states that might think that they're fairly early adopters as well. We have seen a pretty dramatic growth in existing solar homes installations in other states outside of California. California is definitely the leader, but New Jersey and Massachusetts and Connecticut do pretty well, Colorado and Oregon, for example. We just didn't see the new solar home market being penetrated at the same level as the existing home market. And so it could be the case that is what's going on, but we just didn't see much evidence of it.
Yeah, I would also say, I know builders like Lennar, for example, and other builders in recent years are really starting to put solar on new homes outside of California, but we just don't have that data due to a lag. But homes coming online in 2022 or 2023, you will likely see more new homes with solar outside of California.
Yeah, and how does that mandate in California that requires all builders to put it on, how will that change their actions outside of California? So they aren't getting the incentive anymore in California, so they just have to put it on. So maybe they'll figure out a way to do it and still make a profit, and they figure, why not do this outside of California? We did hear when we talked to Lennar, as Grace just sort of inferred, that they're going to be trying to do this outside of California among a number of different innovative technologies they want to explore, one of which is 3D printing of houses that they mentioned. So they're taking advantage. Lennar is the one company that we think we'd probably most likely see a higher penetration rates of solar in their building, in their subdivisions outside of California. But we'll have to see what other folks follow along. There's a question here about, can you clarify the definition of IOU? Is it the same as third-party owned?
Yeah, sorry for the mix up there. So IOU is investor-owned utility, which within California is PG&E, Southern California, and San Diego Gas and Electric. So other areas such as like Sacramento, LA DWP, other areas outside of those are not investor-owned utilities. And the new Solar Home Partnership only applied, that incentive program only applied within the investor-owned utilities. And then that is separate from third-party owned systems, which is just a financing method for who owns the solar system, whether it's a financing party or whether the homeowner actually owns the system themselves.
The last question is having to do with building codes, and that maybe we are missing some of the nuance in building codes that might encourage solar, where there might be not a published state incentive. It might be wrapped up in the building codes, and we'll accept that criticism. Also, we did not take into account individual state or local building codes and where we see solar. Again, we just saw really low penetration, so there wasn't much to go on, but it could be the case that in some locales, surely if they're encouraging solar or they require solar ready homes, for example, they might see higher penetration rates there. So good point. Maybe somebody can follow up with more research in the future that takes into account all of the individual building codes and sees where solar has been adopted in greater numbers. And I will say that this is, as I mentioned, this work was funded by the Solar Energy Technologies Office. They encouraged us to do this in the sort of pre-mandate period. They are funding a number of efforts to look into how to incentivize greater adoption of solar in new home construction. That is in collaboration with builders and the building industry and installers. I'm part of that research project. So they are not giving up on this idea. There are many ways that this could happen. Incentives are only one of the tools that can be used potentially. And so the Solar Office will probably be coming out with more in this area of work in the future, potentially even analyzing new data, just like we did here in 3 or 4 years or something along those lines. So with that, we'll leave it here. We've managed to run out the final bit of the hour. There is one question from a questioner asking for a statement. If you will just reach out to me directly, I will be able to talk to you in greater detail about that. Thank you for the question, though. And thank you for your time today. Really a pleasure to hear from you and get the great questions we did and be able to present this work. And I'll say goodbye to Grace. It's been a pleasure working with you. Good luck with all the things that will come to you in the future. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.